Texts become organising principles of new forms of authority. They are the foundation of a civilization that is truly Western, because it arises out of the struggles, the thought of people, their associations in the territories of Europe. The striking aspect of the new realm of freedom and the democracy of the mind is that they're ends in themselves. So, words. Words are the golden thread. All civilized societies have words as, at the very least, records or as recorded ritual, poetry, song, histories, philosophy and legend or literature. Words and text on clay, stone, parchment or paper are the mark of a civilization. They are artefacts of a durable, shared understanding that exists before any particular individual or generation, and a source of knowledge for those who come later. It's a way of securing the legacy and achievements of a society of its history. Without words, how does meaning or the ideas or values that humanize humanity live on? How fortunate we are that ancient languages and texts in Latin, Greek and Hebrew survived the fall of civilizations and were, as texts, as words, more durable than the societies that created them, shining a light down through dark ages to provide a foundation and legacy for Europeans. Scholarship around texts, especially those of ancient philosophical works, began almost 1,000 years ago to create and beg the question of ways of thinking that were independent of their era, coming from a more superior one, obviously, or free of both the temporal power of kings, princes, or the church, or other religious authorities. These new realms of thought, and the word often born through great struggle, individual heroism and sacrifice, based on a commitment to thinking about words, books and texts, later aided greatly by printing, are the site for an emerging, tangible legacy of freedom, creating durable forms of association or transforming old ones. So this is civilization's golden thread, the freedom to read, think, interpret and to discuss texts that develops into radical forms of association and political freedom that began to emerge 500 years ago. Texts become organising principles of new forms of authority and freedom, especially the liberty of thought. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment, rediscovering and building upon what already existed in antiquity, Western freedom founded a durable legacy that lives through words, liberty of thought and freedom of speech, inspiring new writing and forms of association. So I'm going to make a dash through some 900 years. In the beginning was the Word. It's the opening for the Gospel of John, a prophet and preacher bringing the light into the world. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Bible, a word derived from the ancient Greek, ta biblia, meaning the scrolls or the books, derived itself from biblos, the ancient Phoenician port that gave its name to the papyrus that went to Greece to be written on. The language of John is from the King James Bible in 1611, so it's already lit with the humanism of centuries of interpretation and dispute, and not a few heretics' birds at the stake. And this later gospel dates back to the 1st century, almost 2,000 years. The Bible, the books, illustrates to us the importance of ancient text, the word, not just for the Christian scriptures, but the much greater corpus or body of writings left by the Romans, including the legacies from the Greek and Judaic civilizations. The religious Christian impulse to preserve texts is thus easily understandable because its own foundational text seems divine in origin, so it seems natural to conserve architects from civilization that gave rise to Christianity and many other wonders that were beyond the powers of man in the Dark Ages after the fall of Rome. Our civilization would not have survived by the skin of its teeth, as Kenneth Clark puts it so well, unless the church, which organised most men of intellect, had not preserved Roman manuscripts. And if Charlemagne, Europe's first great man of action since the Romans, through conquest, had not re-established the contact between Northern Europe and the Mediterranean with more ancient culture and texts to learn from, his coronation by the Pope on December 25th, 800, to Charlemagne's chagrin, also enthroned a tension, because it implied papal sovereignty over him, between the spiritual and worldly powers that enriched Western civilization. If either had achieved absolute power, society may have grown as static as the civilizations of Egypt or Byzantium, notes Clarke. This is important. Charlemagne set Alcuin of York, an English clergyman, to work. As a start, he notably persuaded the new Holy Roman Empire not to force pagans to be baptized on pain of death. You can force people to be baptized, but you cannot force them to believe, he argued. This was a significant development leading to the abolition of death penalty for paganism in 797. The church over the next 400 or 500 years was astonishingly successful, attracting some of the best minds and establishing scholastic enterprises, as well as architecture and art in abbeys and monasteries that by the 12th century were truly exceptional. This created tensions as well, echoing Alcuin's opposition to death for pagans right at the beginning. Anselm, the Italian 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury, argued that scholarship of ancient texts should be a matter of an orthodox question of faith. For I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand, he argued. Unless I believe, I shall not understand. Working in France, Saint-Denis in the 20th century, Abelard, an incredible individual and an early hero of the word, took on this outlook, the orthodoxy. I must understand in order that I may believe, he said. By doubting, we come to questioning, and by questioning, we perceive the truth. He was a truly great figure. He was probably more famous for his love affair with a woman pupil, Heloise, which is a wonderful love story. Abelard was vilified by Anselm and other powerful figures in the hierarchy of the church for introducing the ancient pagan ideas of Aristotle into theology, which opened room to the power of individual reasonings. In his book, Sic et Non, or Yes and No, he included the question, must human faith be completed by reason or not? He referenced Aristotle, a pagan, as the most clear-sighted of all the philosophers, desirous above all things else to arouse this questioning spirit. He escaped with his life, on this heresy, with his hierarchy establishing that it would always have the final say, but establishing the internal tension and conflict that the church could never actually overcome or extinguish, and that would, 400 years later, destroy its authority. Clerics such as Abelard established the virtue of human intelligence, even if it's restricted. There was little option for the church, which would have lost thinkers to the worldly courts of princes and kings if it had shut down or crushed this spirit of inquiry. So the primacy of ancient texts as a source of authority outside church or king was the driving force for the Renaissance 200 years later. Petrarch's discovery in 1345 of Cicero's letters fired enormous enthusiasm. They were entered into Florentine thought a new regenerating force, as Clarke puts it. He was no priest nor monk, he was a Christian. He is the true father of the Renaissance, the rebirth of civilization, taking the ancients as a starting point. Dante, a Florentine and another secular figure who established the use of the vernacular with his divine comedy, a significant development that later inspired Chaucer, Thomas More, Milton, had been a friend of his father. Boccaccio was a friend. The library at San Marco, built by Cosimo de' Medici, a prince not a bishop, became a rival to anything the church could produce. Abelard's heresy was about to bear fruit in Florence, creating some of the most peerless art as well as words that had been created by human beings at any time or anywhere. The watchwords taken from Protagoras, an ancient Greek, was man is the measure of all things. The discovery of the individual was made in 15th century Florence, writes Clarke. Indeed, Leonardo Bruni, the humanist chancellor of Florence, himself a translator of ancient Greek, compared his city republic to the Athens of Pericles in 1428. In 1442, Bruni was the first to express and develop the idea of historical progression, beginning with antiquity, followed by darkness, ténèbres, the Middle Ages, and the modern period. And that was in 1442. His republic faded, but its legacy did not, with the rise of universal figures and civilizational heroes or geniuses such as Michelangelo. The durability of Florence and its works, the essence of civilization, survived the city republic's passing, providing a rich legacy through the work of Machiavelli, as important in the realm of the word as Michelangelo was for art for future generations. Fading Florence was eclipsed by a true earthquake in the realm of the word, of books and texts, as printing and the movable type presses developed by Johannes Gutenberg in the 16th century revolutionised civilization. By 1500, after only 50 years of printing, which began with a small run of the Latin Vulgate Bible, 200 copies, there were an estimated 9 to 20 million printed books in circulation, with the revolutionary process spreading quickly to Italy and Holland and later to England with Caxton. His importance, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, he was really not a good printer, was his decision to publish in English, with the vernacular taking off for books in the 1600s. By the end of a tumultuous 16th century, an estimated 200 million books had been printed in a population of some 125 million people, as well as innumerable flyers and single-sheet libels and polemics. For it is a century convulsed by upheaval, with the fall of the church as the ultimate authority on intellectual thought, after the word exploded out of the ecclesiastical world, scholastic libraries or princely courts to be available to everyone. One man whose books were printed very quickly and ended up on bookshelves all over Europe, even the bedside of Charles V, the last Holy Roman Emperor to be crowned by the Pope 730 years after Charlemagne, was Machiavelli. Born in 1469, living till 1527, Machiavelli was a diplomat, a philosopher, who lived the intensity of the Florentine Renaissance and Republic. He drew on his experience. He organised a republican militia to defend the city, even to defeat the hated rivals in Pisa, an extensive diplomacy, as well as a political fall that actually included his torture with the strappado, as well as looking back to the ancients. In his case, reflecting in his discourses circa 1517 on Livy's History of Rome. In it, as is implied in his best known for Prince, Machiavelli makes the case for a republic which commands and keeps the support of the masses, seen as more knowing and constant, he quote, a better defender of civic rights and life than monarchs or princes. Published in a century of turmoil, Machiavelli went further to argue that political and social conflict, tumults, are the catalyst for increased freedoms and ensure the vitality of a republic. In every republic there are two different dispositions, that of the populace and that of the upper class. All legislation favourable to liberty is brought about by the clash between them, he wrote. If we ask what it is the nobility are after and what it is the common people are after, it will be seen in the former that there is a great desire to dominate, and in the latter merely the desire not to be dominated. The hostility and misrepresentation that his work inspired or generated is almost unparalleled and remains even today. This is particularly over his argument that politics is the most important of human activity, for which thereto what is proper and excellent in a man is required. Something, he argued very convincingly, quote, effeminate Christian morality is unsuited for. Christians, he wrote, glorify humble and contemplative men with the highest good humility, abnegation and contempt for worldly things. He, on the other hand, wanted to beatify the love for liberty, magnanimity, bodily strength, and everything that makes men bold. His reflections were timely. Europe was about to be plunged into turmoil, and for the first time since the ancients, thinking back to Pericles or Cicero, the word was to wield as much power as violent force. On October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nailed his lengthy handwritten list of 95 points or thesis to the double doors of the All Saints Church in Wittenberg. And those words lit the fuse that detonated the Protestant Reformation with furious debate, religious schism, and millions of books printed, setting in train martyrdoms, uprising, wars, and a revolution in Western civilization. To the horror of ecclesiastical and worldly powers, as well as the humanist Catholics who had kept quiet about rocking the boat from Abelard to the Renaissance, he was not going to shut up. Here I stand, I can do no other, the famous quote. Unlike previous schisms hushed up in ecclesiastical councils, the debate, thanks to the printing press, was everywhere and everyone waved in. In England, Henry VIII, hoping unsuccessfully to get the Pope on side for his divorce petition, personally and quickly got involved, writing a book in Latin responding to Luther. This is a king writing a book to respond to an obscure a German priest. As Ackroyd narrates in his brilliant biography of Thomas More, the German priest hit back, still in Latin, describing Henry as a pig, a dolt, a liar who deserved to be covered in shit. This was a text that via the super busy presses rattling out book upon book on Reformation and Counter-Reformation was very widely circulated. Henry ordered More to respond. He did in kind, in Latin again. "Look, my fingers are covered with shit when I tried to clean his filthy mouth," he wrote. So it was a robust debate. Charged with stopping the dissemination of heresy, especially from William Tyndale via the presses of Flanders, More took a leap, as many others were to do, to switch to the vernacular, to English. An interesting aside, at first they organised public book burnings of Tyndale's Bible, but that had to be abandoned as it upset people so much. It might have been a heretical text, but it was the holy book after all, the word. Heresies, More found, were circulating among the artisans of London, often gathering in small clandestine groups. He called night schools, I can't get the pronunciation, night schools, to listen and to read. There were conventicles organised by distant priests or scholars and family gatherings. Late medieval society, with its innumerable guilds, largely self-organising and with a very high level of respect and dependency on artisans, was a rich brewer's wort for the yeast of the newly printed book to work on. More, an accomplished writer, joined the fray with relish. Many of his phrases enriched the English language. If he was not now remembered as a Catholic martyred saint, he was executed in 1535, he would, like Chaucer, be remembered for his use of language. He coined or made popular phrases such as jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, one swallow maketh not summer, as well as new innovations. He was the first to use in the English language the word fact, taunt, anticipate, obstruction, and not to see the wood for the trees. They're amongst his creations. The rise of the vernacular, the language of a people, is really significant. In More's dialogue concerning heresies, 1529, for example, he does not treat the audience as moral inferiors who must simply obey, with a book that's a civil political discussion between himself and an imagined young man who's rather similar to his son-in-law, who was a bit of a heretic, leaning towards heresy, that's conducted in the author's own study. He approaches the argument on the level of equality. All writers need to do this if they are to convince their audience or readers, because other books are competing for their intellectual attention too. So a genuinely common national language and culture emerged, one that is based on what Machiavelli would have called a notable equality. That's a large group of people engaged with each other in a growing space defined by freedom of thought. It was the century that gave Western civilization the essay too, penned and printed sometimes within days and widely circulated to large audiences, so, rather superior to a sermon from a pulpit. More lost to the debate, Henry VIII in England left the Catholic Church as the king saw an opportunity to create a new sovereign state with him at its head as of divine right. England escaped the devastating religious wars in Europe for a century or so. In the 16th century was a flowering of Englishness, the English language particularly, set in train by More, under the rule of his daughter Elizabeth I, above all of Shakespeare. William Shakespeare inherited this rich legacy. He had certainly read Machiavelli, and the resounding down-to-earth language of More and the Reformation resounds in his works, which are the foundation not just of the English language, but as Harold Bloom put it, the invention of being human, the map of the mind. So, by the 17th century, an intellectual sphere independent of the church had come into existence, as well as new sovereign states with monarchs and princes such as William of Orange at their head. It's an age of violence and social upheaval, as well as words, books and speech that are heralding the growth of a civic free space. Even the horrors of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, mainly visited upon Germany, why is it always for Germans, are not enough to extinguish the light of a new civilization, just as the Holocaust 400 years later could not. A war of reaction by the church and the princes, effectively a civil war at the end of the Holy Roman Empire. It was devastating, fought primarily in Central Europe, and estimated 8 million soldiers and civilians died from the effects of the fighting, famine or disease. In terms of today's European population, that would be some 80 million dead. In World War II, the figure was 38 million. In parts of Germany, the population was decimated by over 50%. It was a horrific conflict. But even so, it was not enough to destroy or even reverse the process unleashed by the Reformation. The new realm of the word, of free thought in the book, continued to grow. In fact, it accelerated. Both in Europe and Britain during this period, the growth of the new realm that was neither the Holy Roman Church or other established Protestant churches, nor the state continued to consolidate itself. This was the civic domain of associations via trades, guilds or clubs and pubs or salons, and something called the hush shop. And the hush shop were basically illegal pubs, as well as distant nonconformist chapels or gatherings demanding and often getting, even if it was usually by the turning of a blind eye, freedom of religion. The Reformation, as Peter Ackroyd noted, had created a world that, quote, may be compared to the banned radical groups in late 18th century London, as well as to the Puritan millenarian of the 1640s, and captured the inherent spirit of civic revolt. It was a time of civil war, but also the rise of freedoms that increasingly were expanding from the religious to the political sphere. John Milton's Areopagitica, 1644, a demand for the freedom of oppressors, the word, gives us the flavour of the age. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely, according to conscience, above all liberties, he wrote, opening, of course, with a quote from an ancient Greek Euripides. In England and Holland under threat from France, groups and associations of individuals had come together to take responsibility for the defence of society and the new freedoms, including the creation of republican militias. Think of Rembrandt's A Night Watch, think of the English New Model Army. The debate now went beyond the Reformation to political philosophy, asking how best to defend the new freedom. Should it be a strong sovereign state standing above to guarantee liberties as argued by Hobbes? His vision of an unrestrained political state of nature as a state of war of all against all followed the horrors of Europe's civil wars. Or should it be that the realm of freedom itself is the best guarantee, as Spinoza was to argue, following Machiavelli? And of course we know that Spinoza had Machiavelli's collected works on his bookshelves. He argued that with true freedom, the more people have political power, the greater chance that you can arrive at reasonable politics, at something that is in the common interest. Otherwise, you end up with a society dominated by the interests of a monarch or an aristocratic clique. So Spinoza wrote in his theological political treatise, it is not the aim of the state to reduce man from rational beings to animals or automatons, but on the contrary, to see to it that their minds and bodies can function safely and that they themselves use free reason and do not fight with hatred, anger or deceit, nor allow themselves to be carried away by bitter feelings towards each other. The aim of politics is therefore really freedom. So I've lingered historically to stress these developments as they are the foundation of a civilization that is truly Western, because it arises out of the struggles, the thought of people, their associations in the territories of Europe, beginning with the golden thread and legacy of the ancients in the form of texts. This new legacy is both durable and consequential. It changed the world forever, bringing a revolutionary era of historical consciousness, new states, nations and revolutions, and political freedom based on the new realm of the universal word, speech, texts and association. There's no slavery here. In the tradition of Western civilization, to enslave is to de-civilize. It is the epitome of barbarity. The new era, as the 18th century opens with a bang, was the American Revolution, a critical event that built on many of the practices of liberty fought for in England, with, of course, many colonizers in America literally shaped by that history. America is quickly followed by France. Hannah Arendt, as ever, nails it, as the establishment of a new communal form that is neither an inner realm or a mere choice between alternatives or the lesser of evils. She writes, freedom for them could only exist in public. It was a tangible worldly reality, something created by men, to be enjoyed by men rather than a gift or capacity. It was the man-made public space or market space which antiquity had known as the area where freedom appears and becomes visible to all. So these new notions erupt again to the fore at the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution, which we've discussed at length here at the Academy in previous years. So just 2 points in passing. France ushers in a new age of revolutions, leading to the rise of nations, the new realm writ large. Most importantly, Germany, with a new consciousness of history as an accomplishment of mankind, a progression and an unfolding of freedom. However, the question of the state versus freedom and the new democratic historical consciousness is unresolved, with hostility, tense hostility, from elites who across Europe sought to check its spread. This tension is expressed in beautiful language and words in the clash between Thomas Paine, an English theorist and leading light in the American Revolution, later in France, and Edmund Burke, an English defender of monarchy. So this led to the emergence of new struggles for democracy with new conceptions of the state itself based on, as Harrant argued, an entirely different notion of a people's or nation's sovereignty, which is inspired by antiquity and which has emerged over and over again in all the revolutions of the modern era. This is a form of revolutionary patriotism, but was actually later eclipsed by state nationalism, especially that of Britain, France and Germany, imperial powers fighting for empires, not popular sovereignty, while patriotism can mobilise, Rembrandt's Night Watch, fighting to defend an imperial statist order, especially after the 20th century's world wars, is a very different kettle of fish. In contemporary Western societies where patriotism is now viewed or denounced, in fact, as little more than fascism, one wonders how they could defend themselves against attack. This concrete sphere of freedom, a community where people can interact, speak, deliberate and decide, shows how communal life should be constituted and run without force or violence. This is a historical first in the modern era. It is a realm of political equality. There are disagreements, even heated ones, but differences of ideas or religion are not an organising principle to define moral inferiors. This includes the practice or the virtue of tolerance as a foundation for freedom. It protects our freedom to have our own beliefs and to live by them. The only limit is that beliefs cannot become practices if they cause physical harm, sectarian violence, or override political freedom. These practices of political freedom created new areas of human accomplishment, with the popular expansion of the pursuit of knowledge, with the rise of a democracy of the mind developed through the fight for a free press, particularly in Britain. While the Sunday schools of nonconformist chapels were teaching people to read, to teach them how to write was a taboo, especially for the Methodists. I have no idea why. William Cobbett, 1763 to 1835, a former ploughboy and soldier turned radical, along with Hazlitt and much later Orwell, is one of the English language's greatest essayists. In 1823, he published a very successful grammar of the English language, taking the ruling class to task for their use of English. An enterprise repeated by his successor in many ways, Orwell, in his seminal 1946 essay, Politics in the English Language. Through the efforts of Cobbett, radical halls dedicated to political learning and science, organised by the cooperative Owenite movements, or chapel schools, or these fervent conversations in the hush shops, illegal pubs of Lancashire and elsewhere, England developed a democracy of the mind, probably unparalleled anywhere in the world in its day. The explosion in autodidactic education drove the demand for a universal education that would equip the people, their children, for the realm of freedom and democracy. So what was democracy of the mind? It was the culture of argument, education and writing, to quote Lionel Trilling, that sought to look at things simply and directly, having only in mind our intention of finding out what they really are, not the prestige of our great intellectual act of looking at them. He argued it's based on the equality of the belief that all may become full members of a society of thinking men. It implies that our job is not to be an intellectual, certainly not to be intellectual in this fashion or that, but merely to be intelligent according to our lights, releasing us from the belief that the mind can only work in a technical, professional way and that it must work competitively. The striking aspect of the new realm of freedom and the democracy of the mind is that they're ends in themselves, not a mere means to another objective, whether it be, I don't know, socialism or communism or something. They are an end. In themselves, and this is very important. With the birth of capitalism in Britain, the amazing increase in productive forces raised the possibility of a universal Periclean or Athenian British democracy with no slaves and a commonwealth for all, and that's really what Chartism, for example, was all about. This challenge to the state and established elites quickly led to the development of ideologies against the people, from Burke to Malthus, onwards into totalitarianism in the 20th century. And in fact, the English working class's first experience of capitalism is basically Malthusian poor laws. It's a fascinating period. But the trend was unstoppable. It was durable. Surviving in the 20th century, Europe's fascist turn, totalitarianism, Stalinism, 2 world wars and the Holocaust. So a new problem, identified by George Orwell, significantly, Arendt as well in different ways, emerges in the post-Second World War period, an era that combined the fear that untrammeled politics leads to the Gulag or Auschwitz with a growing indifference to defending freedom and the everyday culture of the democracy of the mind. In today's world, that indifference has turned to hostility, militant hostility. Freedom is seen as antisocial, as being founded on privileged egotism. How dare you offend? What is going on is a redefinition of how we live, our manners, how we interact, the tearing down of what makes us who we are, and often what we hold dear, what has arisen from this sphere that emerged that I've tried to chart. It's about meaning. So these are battles. The battles we're talking about today have real consequences, far more than just individuals, because they are militantly trying to corrode, destroy the tenets, principles and foundations that sustain us and our communities. Our legacy of freedom, the past, is stigmatised as the era of slavery and racism, or worse, and in an amazing denial, because it can't be an ignorance, and an amazing denial of the actual historical record. I mean, this is, the whole premise of the emergence. I mean, Clarke makes the point as well. The whole premise of this emergence of this new realm of freedom was the abolition of slavery and the battle to expel force and violence from the realm of freedom, political equality. Any defence of the gains of freedom is dismissed as a reactionary, nostalgic worldview, one that never, a place that never really existed. Beginning in the 1960s, when the hostility to this realm of Western civilization really took off, with radicals who disavowed the most basic structures of democracy and the culture of civic life, force and violence is being invited back in to regulate the realm of speech and thought. As we know today, we're in the sights of senior police officers, much of the public sector. If someone informs on you, your employer will sack you. Magistrates are on the lookout, universities, schools, and there's a whole army of people trolling, scouring through social media or every word that you've ever written anywhere. Denouncing and informing was once stigmatised. In the sphere of freedom, it's very much stigmatised. But now you're a good, morally superior social activist if you can grasp someone up and get them fired. It's even better if they're arrested. Some ideas, certain meanings, those of the orthodoxy, are sacred, even if that means protecting religious bigotry, but only the Islamic variant from criticism. And Spinoza must be spinning in his grave to see some of the contemporary debate. Membership associations are viewed with intense suspicion unless they can be weaponised by the elite. I don't know if people followed the battles over the National Trust late last year and beginning of this year. the biggest membership organisation with 6 million members in Europe, but history, heritage, conserving it, that's bad. So words and meaning are critical. The word. Those who want to dismantle our civilization, founded on freedom and democracy, are very engaged with the word and meaning, but in a bad way. The word cannot be allowed to stand alone anymore, and we should not be free to find our own meanings or understanding. Books and texts increasingly have to be authorised, checked, hedged with warnings, and submitted to the dismal fact-checking of those who know best. Meaning is important to determine ourselves what meaning is, the language we use, and our language actually emerged as this sphere of freedom came into existence is profoundly basic and important. So, to end, what are we fighting for? So it's simply to conserve and protect these ways of life, these freedoms and communities that are precious to it, because that's where our roots are. Our roots are in this durable legacy of freedom, a legacy that that emerged through sacrifice of some great heroes, and we can talk a bit about this later on. It's a tangible, real site of our autonomy. Now, I'm confident in this fight, so let's talk about it.